As I've been coming up with 2D workflows for Blender and add-ons to work with them, I came up with this little graphic to show all the different relationships between 2D and 3D in Blender and how to go from raster to vector and back and all the different ways that things work. It helps me to understand the workflows in general, but also I thought I would share it with everybody. Obviously, it has some issues. The text is brought in odd because this is actually brought in as an SVG. I used my stacking layers thing for SVGs. And text often comes in like this, and it's because the way that Blender brings in an SVG, it doesn't really understand where to fill and where to make connections. So a good way to show this, we'll put this in edit mode, and you can see like where it puts some of these vertices and stuff, and why it looks like it does. It's just something to be aware of when importing SVGs, that some of the paths, especially with paths within paths, it really gets confused about. So if you separate these as a separate shape and then do a Boolean on it later or something, you're going to be a little safer. But I want to go ahead and show that as something that's interesting, within a 2D workflow. Something else that I thought was interesting is the whole concept of fills versus borders. You can see here that the outline is actually brought in as a separate shape as the fill. And that's because the way that SVGs are brought into Blender, they don't have an outline separate from a fill. You can have a fill or you can have an outline, and that's based on your material is the fill. So in order to get something like this, you have to do an SVG that has the outline as a separate path. Okay, so this graphic is not just meant to be a mental model for 2D to 3D stuff in Blender, it's also meant to be a guide for this video. So I'm going to go through each of these major areas, and then if anybody has ones that I missed, I'm interested to know about that. I think there are definitely subsections and more nuanced things that you could do, but I wanted to capture the major areas and not confuse it too much. Here we have an image as a plane. It's brought in as exactly that. You go to here, images as planes. This is an add-on that's included in Blender. It doesn't do anything real special. It's just a convenience thing. It creates a plane and automatically gives it a texture that is the image that you provide. What I have seen people do with this is they will add some loop cuts in here. You can see I've added a few already. And then when they extrude it, it will keep the image texture with that object that you extruded. So you can see here I did this with the step in this image. So yeah, you can see it there. This one is also a simple plane. The difference is that in the material, I added a bump map to it. Right, so I did this in JS displacement. It has a color, and that goes into the base color, but then it has a height map that goes into bump, and that's where you end up with the subtle looking bumps. You can see, especially when it comes to the reflections, how it changes. It is pretty subtle though. It's not changing geometry. It's still a single plane. This is that same plane, but and even has the same material, but here I've added a subdivision and displacement with the same height map. So when you add the displacement, and the displacement, this is still just a raster image, the displacement will start adding heights to the actual geometry. And the reason I have the subdivision here is because it can only do displacement for geometry resolution that it has. So if you only had 4 squares here, it's not going to do much. But once you have a bunch of subdivisions here, and this is actually just the mesh, and then I added a subdivision on top of it, then you can do the displacement with the displacement modifier. So this actually has the same looking texture and bump map, the big difference being that it has that displacement modifier on it. And again, this is still just a raster image. There's no special data in here. This technique would be really useful on a topology map where you've got mountains and lakes and rivers and valleys, and the hot to cool type map would represent the heights, and you could quickly grab a terrain map like that and displace a plane, and it would be pretty accurate. In order to go from a raster image to a vector image, you can do an image trace. There's lots of applications that will do an image trace, a lot of free applications that'll do it, and there's something in Blender here. I don't recommend the one that's in Blender. It's called a trace degrees pencil. It's only meant for black and white, and it's very rudimentary. So I showed an example here of a result. Not very happy with it, and I would trace in just about any other program. But I wanted to go ahead and include it here and show it. One thing I wanted to mention is that when going from raster to vector, it's not the same as just having a great vector image, because you can only trace what is existing there. But in a well done vector image, you'll often have geometry that goes behind other things that are obstructing it. So when you do that trace, you're not going to be able to recreate the stuff behind it just by tracing it. You'd have to go into the vector and actually do that. And all that obstructed geometry is very useful in doing later operations with 3D. Now we're starting to get into the vector side of things with Blender. This is an SVG shape. It's a pretty complex shape. I wouldn't want to have to do this inside of Blender, but if you find this shape, and there's lots of like ornamental libraries and stuff, it's pretty easy to give it some depth, make it a object, Boolean, cut it from something, modify it, whatever. And all I did on this after importing is I went into its curve properties and gave it an extrusion height. Right? There's not a whole lot to that. So after this, you can still turn it into a mesh and work with it like you would any other mesh, and you're golden. So this is something somewhat unique to curves. I'm not sure how much people realize you can do this kind of stuff, but this is just a circle that this profile is added to in order to create this this shape. Now you don't have to do it with circle. It can be any path, but as long as the profile doesn't end up intersecting itself, then they turn out pretty good like this. And this is still a curve. If we go over here into the curve properties, under Bevel, it's got a bevel object, and that bevel object is this profile. Fairly interesting technique. I came across it when I wanted to have a profile routed out of a plane for like woodworking looking stuff, and worked pretty good for that. Next up is knifecut. Knifecut's pretty interesting in that you bring in a shape and then you can project it through through a mesh, and it's going to give it that geometry. So I'm going to go here to the wireframe mode, and you can see what I did. You can have it project all the way through to the other side. You can have it project just onto a face, and you don't even have to do it flat. I think it's usually beneficial to have it flat. You have a predictable result. But if I wanted to have this shape and project it at an angle, it would do it exactly as I was looking at it. So once you have a shape and you project it into something, it tries to find the way to bridge the faces, like these lines or these edges. And you might want to create your own way that it does that for shading purposes, but it's still really useful to be able to do this. And then you can easily select those faces, extrude them, modify them, whatever you want, and it's all the same object, right? So I didn't do any Booleans here. There's no Boolean unions or anything like that, and this ends up being a lot cleaner than if you had to do this all through Booleans. The coloring isn't anything specific. I just applied the JS displacement material to the cube, and then I allowed the shape that I cut out to be another material, just the default material, so you could see the difference. Got a couple more things here to show. Here I've got a flat SVG shape of a pawn. I imported that and turned it into a mesh, and then did a screw modifier on it, and it revolved it around kind of like a lathe, and gave me a three-dimensional shape from this flat one. Pretty quick, pretty handy, and I like the result, at least for that need. And then let me do this real quick. I'm going to duplicate this, rotate it. I'm going to use these in order to be a guide for where to place the pawn. Right, so I need to apply its rotation. And then I'm going to get the bottom surface and set the origin to the bottom. So you can see there, I've set the origin to the bottom instead of the middle of the mass. And I just did that so that I can show here that if I take this, and I'm going to go to Align Tools. Align Tools is pretty handy. I'm going to select this and Align Location, and it's going to put it there. All right, so I can duplicate this again. Duplicate this again, select here, Align Location. All right. All right. So if you have an SVG and you've got all kinds of different precision placements, whether it's along a path or contours or whatever, making a shape, a formation, it might be easier to bring it in as an SVG and then place everything along that. I've got a helper tool to do this very quickly, but it shouldn't be needed. The Align Tools is included in Blender. I do recommend it. And you can do these type things where you can use an SVG as a placement guide, and it's kind of interesting. And that's all I've got for this video. I hope that you were able to get something out of it. If I missed something, please let me know. If there's something that you'd like to see or that you think I should cover, I'd be interested in that feedback. And I will definitely be showing some more stuff as I go, definitely with more specifically how I applied things in a scene rather than this technical video. And we'll continue this journey together to find better ways to bring 2D workflows into Blender and make things a little more accessible. Bye.